Hey everyone, welcome to this React crash course video. ReactJS is a widely used front-end development library. So if you're just starting or wish to brush up your basics, then you're in the right place. This video will cover all the basic concepts of ReactJS. First, we'll look at what ReactJS is. Then, we'll see how to install and set up the React environment. Then, we'll move on to learn the fundamental concepts of components, props, and states. Lastly, we'll conclude the session by creating a simple calculator app. But before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss an update. I'm sure you're excited to learn, so let's dive right in. Let's go ahead and begin with what is React. React is a JavaScript library used to build fast and interactive user interfaces for both web and mobile applications. Now, one thing that makes React extremely powerful is the fact that it's open source. Any user can access its source code, modify it, and enhance it. In a typical model view controller architecture, React defines the view part of the application. It is also responsible for how the app looks and feels. Fun fact, React was built by Jordan Walke, an engineer at Facebook. Now let's go ahead and see how React works in real time. Consider a typical web application, say Instagram. The entire UI of the web page is divided into several components. We have the search component, a profile description component, stories component, and a post list component. These components make the code easier to debug and always remain discrete. Components also make development and maintenance of web applications faster, as multiple developers can work simultaneously on different components of the same web application. Now let's see why React is so popular these days. React helps in creation of dynamic web applications. It also provides performance enhancements. Now there are several performance enhancements like virtual DOM and one-way data binding. We'll learn about these topics a little later in the video. React uses reusable components. Now this helps decrease the development time. React involves unidirectional flow of data. React also has a small learning curve. Compared to other frameworks like Angular, React is much easier to learn. React can also be used for mobile applications. React recently released an extension called React Native that is used for developing mobile applications that are cross-compatible. It also has dedicated tools for easy debugging. Now let's dive in to the features of React. First, let's understand JSX. JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript. Using JSX, we can add HTML to the JavaScript file. All coding in React is done using JSX. It also helps in making the code easier to understand and debug. Ultimately, JSX is a combination of JavaScript and HTML. Now let's consider a small example. Const simple here is a JavaScript notation. H1 tags indicate HTML. Again, the semicolon indicates JavaScript. Note that the semicolon is not mandatory. However, it's a good practice to include it. Moving on, the next feature is virtual DOM. DOM, which is an acronym for Data Object Model, actually defines how documents are accessed and manipulated in a web page. It represents the entire structure of the web page in the form of a tree. Now let's see how this actually works. React creates a virtual DOM that is the exact copy of the real DOM. Traditionally, whenever something changes in the web application, all objects in the real DOM are updated. This makes it extremely slow. Let's see how React counters this. Now consider two objects whose states have been changed. React now compares the virtual DOM with the virtual DOM snapshot that was taken right before the update. By comparing the new virtual DOM with the pre-update version, React figures out exactly which virtual DOM objects have changed. Now React only updates those objects on the virtual DOM. This makes a big difference when it comes to speed. Coming to the next feature, performance. React uses virtual DOM. As discussed earlier, virtual DOM impacts the speed of the web applications. We also took an example of Instagram and learned how multiple components can affect the development time. They help improve performance drastically. The next feature is one-way data binding. This means information flows in only one direction. One-way data binding is specifically used when information is displayed and not updated. Remember that the components of React are functional in nature. That is, they receive information through arguments and pass information via their return values. The next important feature is extensions. React has many extensions that we can use to create full-fledged front-end applications. It provides server-side rendering, which means that the application is rendered on the server rather than in the browser. React Native, which is a React extension, is used for developing mobile applications. There are many other extensions that React provides for every scenario in web development. Now let's look at a few of them. React Native lets you build mobile applications using only JavaScript. A React Native app is a real mobile application and not just a web application running on your mobile devices. Thousands of applications like Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Skype use React Native. The next popular React extension is Flux. Flux is the application architecture that Facebook uses. Flux implements a unidirectional flow, which makes it easier to understand what actually is going on. Now let's see how it works. When we trigger an action, the dispatcher will get notified. The dispatcher receives actions and dispatches them to the stores. A store is what holds the data of an application. Stores will register with the application's dispatcher so that they can receive actions. Data from stores is displayed in views. Actions define the internal API of your application. They capture how anything might interact with your application. The last feature of React is debugging. React applications are easy to debug thanks to the large and active developer community. You can practically debug React codes within your browser. Now notice the small React extension icon at the top right corner. This developer tool allows the user to inspect the code and also easily debug it. Moving on, let's learn about the building blocks of React. Components, state, and props are the essential concepts that one should know before implementing React. They are the foundation on which React is built. Now, what exactly are React components? Components are the building blocks of any React application. React divides the user interface into multiple components, wherein each component defines how a particular element is viewed in the application. React components remain discrete and are processed independently. Another feature is reusability. Components can be reused multiple times across the application. This reduces the development time. Consider the following code snippet. A component is implemented as a JavaScript class having some state and a render method. State is the data which we want the component to render. The render method is responsible for how the UI looks and feels to the user. The next concept is state. State of a component is an object that holds some data. This data influences the output of a component. Every time the state of an object changes, the component is re-rendered onto the screen. Now let's see what props are. Props, or short for properties, allow us to pass arguments or data to components. Properties help make components more dynamic. It is important to define all the properties, their types, and their default value. Props are passed to components in a way similar to that of HTML tag attributes. Now consider the following code snippets. This shows exactly how properties are passed to components. Also, detailed illustrations on components, props, and state will be shown in the upcoming videos, so stay tuned for that. Moving on, let's go through some of the things that you should know before you can actually start working on React. You should be familiar with programming concepts like functions, objects, arrays, and classes. One should also have a basic knowledge of JavaScript and a familiarity with HTML. Don't worry if you feel like you're not good at them. Once you start working on them, you'll get a good hang of it. Finally, let's go through the impact of React on the IT industry and get insights into the salaries of React developers. Statistics show that React developers earn way more than other web developers. According to PayScale, the average salary for a React developer in the United States is a whopping $91,000. The average salary for a React developer in India is 7.25 lakhs per annum. Over the recent years, React has gained immense popularity and is being adopted by many companies. According to the data by Google Trends, React has had a better growth scale compared to other frameworks like Angular and Vue. Statistics show that front-end developers have wholeheartedly adopted this lightweight framework, foregoing other available options. If you are skilled and have a knack for front-end development, React can help you gain fantastic career opportunities. Lastly, talking about a few companies that use React devotionally, we have Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, Dropbox, WhatsApp, among others. In this video, we'll be learning all about React installation on Windows. To set up the React development environment, we need two things installed, Node and a text editor of your choice. So let's begin by installing Node.js. We can head to the official Node.js website, say download Node.js. So here you can see the Windows installer. Depending on your system, you can either download the 32-bit version or the 64-bit version. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the 64-bit version. Since it's already installed on my system, I'm not again installing Node. You can follow the installation guidelines and download it. Once you're done with Node installation, you can go ahead and download a text editor of your choice. So I'd suggest VS Code. So let's head to the VS Code page. Say download VS Code. Click on the first link and download the 64-bit version for Windows. Once you're done with the installation of both Node and your text editor, you can start creating your first React application. So for that, let's create a folder. I'm creating it on my desktop, while you can create it in any of your drives. Let's call it first React. Now open your command prompt. Now you can type in the path for the folder that you just created. So say cd users first React. Now go ahead and type in the command npm install -g create React app. Okay, so this command installs all the necessary React.js modules. Now to check if the version is correctly installed, you can type in create React app version. So you can see the version here. Now let's continue and develop your React application. Type in the command create React app and you can give a name to your application. So I say my app. Now this should take a couple of minutes. Okay. Once you've successfully created your application, they say to begin by typing the following commands. So let's do that. Say cd my app and npm start. This should typically start your application, and here we go. Alright. You can also open your application in the text editor that you've downloaded. So let's go ahead and open VS Code. VS Code, file, open folder, go to your desktop or the drive that you've saved your folder in. First React, my app, and I say select folder. So as you can see, all your modules have been imported. You can click on app.js and start editing. In this video, we'll be learning all about the most basic infrastructure of React.js called components. So we'll be touching on topics like what are components, types of components, nesting components, higher order and pure components, and a brief description about component lifecycle. Alright, to begin with, what exactly are components? Components are the building blocks of a React application wherein each component represents a part of the user interface. Now to make it more understandable, consider the Facebook homepage. The entire UI can be broken down into several elements. Say we have the credentials component, the sign up component, the image component, and the logo component. Notice that each component adds something to how the homepage looks. Alright, reusability is one of the salient features of React components. One component can be reused several times across the application, and this improves the development speed. Components can also be nested. One component can internally consist of several other components. In its minimal form, a component must define a render method that specifies how exactly the application looks and feels. A component can also receive properties from its parent components. Also, you'll get a better understanding of all of these when we start working hands-on, so don't worry. So, moving on, let's look at the different types of components. First, we have the stateless functional components, and then we have the stateful class components. Now, functional components are typical JavaScript functions that return HTML. Now, they can be contained in a .js or a .jsx file. Coming to class components, these are regular ESX classes. However, it's mandatory that they contain a render method that in turn returns HTML. They can also be contained in .js or a .jsx file. Okay then, let's go ahead and build our first React application using components. Alright, so I've opened my text editor, that is VS Code, to build my application. Also, I suggest you watch the React installation on Windows video to help you get started. The video briefly explains how to install Node and how to start building your first React application. In my case, I've opened a folder called React Component Tutorial, and here in my source folder, I have app.js. Now, app.js is the main component that gets rendered to the DOM. Let me show you that. Here in index.js, you pass app.js, which is a component that gets rendered to the React DOM. So app.js consists of several other components that can be nested. So as you can see, app.js is a functional component. And before moving on, let me get rid of all the unnecessary code. So let me delete all of this and return an h1 tag that says hello, welcome to Simplilearn. Let me save it, and if you look at the browser, you'll have hello, welcome to Simplilearn. Now let's go ahead and display another message. Say h1, this video is about components. Alright, let me save it and let me check the browser. It gives you an error. So JSX uses a conventional rule which states that all HTML tags have to be enclosed within a div tag. So for example, I say div and I enclose it. So let me save and check my browser again. Here you go. So multiple HTML tags have to be enclosed within the div tag. Moving on, let's create our first functional component. To do that, I'll first create a folder in my source folder, say components. Within that, I'll create a file, say functional component.js. Alright, so the first thing we have to do is import React. So I say import React from React. The general syntax for a functional component involves the keyword function and say functional component. Now you say return an h1 tag, or I've already used h1 tags, so I'll say paragraph and I say this is a functional component. Alright. Before explaining to you how these components are exported and imported, let me show you the general syntax for a class component. So I create another file, say class component.js. I again import React from React. The general notation is using the class keyword followed by the name of the class extending from the base class React.component. So going ahead, I say class component extends React.component. Now the key feature of a class component is the usage of a render method. So I say render, within braces I say return a paragraph tag saying this is the class component. Alright. So moving on, let's see how these components can be nested into the main component, that is app.js. Components can be nested into the main component using import and export keywords. So as the name suggests, export feature is used to export a particular file or a module, and import is used to import a particular file or a module into the current existing module. So we have two different types of exports. You have default export and just export or named export. So a default export is used to export just one object, be it a function, a class, a variable, from the file, and there can only be one default export per file. And when you're importing it, you can specify the address and use the word import before it. So let me show you how it works. Let's go back to our editor and then functional component. And here I say export default and the name of the functional component, that is functional comp. So let me save this, and going back to my app.js, I say import name of the functional component, that is functional comp from, and I pass the path, that is components/functional component. Also, let me get rid of these unnecessary files here. Now let's define functional component in our app.js component. So here I say functional comp. Let's compile it and check our browser. Here it says this is our functional component. Moving on to my class component, it's the same syntax here as well. I say export default name of my component, and in my app.js I import it. Import class comp from the path. And again, I'll have to define it in my return method. I say, so let me compile it and check my browser. It says this is the class component. One unique feature of default export is that I can rename the file while I'm importing it. So for example, I can rename it as say FC, and while I'm defining it, I'll have to make sure I use the same naming conventions. So I say FC again. And when I check it, it says this is the functional component. There's literally no difference. The next type of export is the named export or just export. So a named export can be used to export multiple objects, be it functions, class, etc. from a file. Now there can be several named exports from a single file. One hack is that while you're importing, it cannot be renamed. So let me show you how this works. Okay, so let's create another class in our class component. So I'll just copy paste this. Let me give it another name, say class comp1. And the message that I want to display is, hey, I'm another class. Alright, so when I'm exporting it, I don't want default. So let me take it off and say export here. Alright, In my app.js, while importing it, I want to import both the classes. So I'll include them within curly braces here. I say class comp, comma, class comp1. And then again, I define it here, class comp1. Let's compile it and run it. And here we go. Here you can see, hey, I'm another class. So we've successfully exported both the classes from the class component and imported it back in our app.js component. One advantage of using named export is the fact that I can choose to import the classes that I want to. Now say for example, I do not want to import class component here. So let me take it off. And here, let me comment this. Now let's compile and see. Hey, I'm another class. The second class got imported while the first class I was defined earlier is not imported here. Alright, so next up we have higher order and pure components. Now I won't get into the nitty-gritties of it because they're advanced topics, but to give you a brief insight, higher order components are basically functions that take in a component and return a new component. The whole ideology behind higher order components is to facilitate the reusability of component logic. Okay, so let's see how this works. Let's go back to our code editor. Let's create a component. In our components folder, let's call the component click.js. Alright, so here we define a class. I use the snippet RCE. Here we go. We get the entire format using the small snippet RCE. And here I'm going to make use of a button. Now say I use the tag button and I'll say clicked one time. Every time the user clicks on the button, the value gets incremented. So for this, I'm going to use a variable say count and I'm going to use the concept of states. So let's go ahead and define our variable count and initialize it to 0. So for that, I'm going to use another snippet called rconst. And here, this dot state equals my variable count, initializing it to 0. So let's define the count variable in our render method. So I say const count equals this dot state. So every time we click on the button, the count value has to get incremented, right? So we make use of an event called onClick equals this dot update click. Now update click is going to be another method that we have to define now. So every time the button gets clicked, this method is called. So let's go ahead and define the function. So it is update click equals is going to be an arrow function, and I say this dot set state is nothing but count this dot state dot count plus 1. Okay, and here we say count times. Alright, so once this is done, let's import our component in app.js. So here again, I say import click from components click. And let's define it here. So let's check our browser. Every time we click on the button, the value gets incremented. Alright, so let's go ahead and create another component, say counter.js, wherein every time the user hovers the mouse on the button, the count value increases. So let's go ahead and do that. I say counter.js. I'm again going to use the snippet RCE to create a class component. And here in my div tag, I define a button and say incremented to, for now I say X. So now let's go ahead and add the event, say button on mouse enter. I'm going to call the method this dot increment count. Okay, so once you're done with that, let's go ahead and define the increment count method. I'm going to copy the same code that I've mentioned in my click.js. So I say copy this. Alright, so one change is that I'll change the name of the method and call it increment count. Again, let's define the count in our render method. So I say const count equals this dot state. And here I change X to count. Now let's go ahead and import it in our app.js. So I say import counter from components and counter. And let's define it here. Alright, let's save it and let's run the code. Okay, so as you can see, you see another button here incremented to 0, and every time I move my cursor on the button, it increments. Mind you, I'm not clicking, I'm just hovering my mouse. Okay, to learn how higher order components work, we'll have to pass counter.js and click.js as parameters to give birth to an entire new component. So for that, let's go ahead and create another component for our HOC. Let's call it higher order.js. Okay, so I say import React from React. After that, I say const updated component equals original component. That's going to be an arrow function again. And within curly braces, I define my class. That is class, say, new component extends React.component. Inside, let's define a render method that returns the original component with a modification, that is, I want to type the user. I want to append the user before the actual message is displayed. Alright, so let's go ahead and close the tag and return new component, and let's export this. Say export default updated component. Now we import higherorder.js in our counter.js and click.js and pass these components as parameters. So let's do that. Let's go to our counter.js, and here I say import updated component from /higherorder component. And here, while exporting, I say updated comp and pass this as my parameter. Let's do the same to click.js. Here I import updated comp from higherorder component, and here I pass this as a parameter. Now here in our higherorder component, we've defined a property name and initialized it to the user. So we'll have to include this in our other components, that's counter and click. So let's do that. And here, right before incremented to, I say this dot props dot name. Let me save it. Let me do the same thing here and say this dot props dot name. So if you go back to our browser, here you can see it says the user clicked 0 times and the user incremented to 0. Okay. So this basically shows how React implements reusability of components. Moving on, our next topic is pure components. Now, another way to create class component is by extending pure component from React. A pure component avoids unnecessary re-renders. Now, how does it do it? It does not implement the should component update method. Now, you'll learn about this method a little later in the video. Now, this method enables re-rendering of components to the DOM. But a pure component, on the other hand, ensures a shallow comparison of states and props and checks if a re-render is actually necessary. Only then does it render to the DOM. A React component can be considered pure if it renders the same output for the same state and props. So let's take an example to explain pure components. So let's go back to our VS Code and create two component classes, one for a regular component and the other for a pure component. Now using this example, I'll show you exactly how pure component is more helpful. Okay, so let's create a pure component.js file. I say purecomp.js. So here I'm going to use a snippet rpce that is going to create a pure component class. Let me get rid of this export. And here in my div tag, I'll display the text, say I'm the pure component. Alright, now let's go ahead and create a regular component. I may call it regular component.js. And here I'm going to use the snippet rce. And the message that I'd want to display is I'm the regular component. So to draw a comparison between the regular component and the pure component, let's create a parent component for the two. So let me create one here. I'll call it parent component.js. And this is again going to be a regular class component. And here I display the message, I am the parent component. To change the state of the component, we're going to make use of a constructor. So let's use the snippet rconst. And here let me create name. You can give anything and I say Simplilearn. Now we make use of the component didMount lifecycle method to set a time interval. Now don't worry about this. We're going to learn about it a little later in the video. So moving ahead, I'm going to make use of the method and say component didMount. And here I say set interval. And the first argument is going to be an arrow function and the second will be the time interval. And I'm going to be setting it to 3 seconds. Now within the arrow function, I'll make use of the setState function to set the state of my property. However, I do not change the name. I keep it Simplilearn itself. Moving on, let's import pure component and the regular component into our parent component and then pass name as a property. So to do that, first import purecomp from pure component and then I say import regular comp from regularcomp.js. And here, let's say regular comp name equals this dot state dot name. And I say pure component name equals this prop.state.name. Now let's include the property name in both our regular and pure components. So to do that, let's just say this.prop.name, and here I again say this.prop.name. And finally, let's import parent component into our app.js component. So here I say import parent com from, okay, and here let me define parent com. So now if you look at the browser, we have I'm the parent, I'm regular component Simplilearn, and I'm the pure component Simplilearn. We've got the result as expected. Now to check if the pure component is actually re-rendering or not, let's include simple console.log statements. So here I say clg snippet, and here I say pure component render. And in my regular component, I do the same thing. I say console.log regular component render. Now let's do the same in our parent component as well. Here I say parent component render. Alright, so let's go back to our browser and inspect it in our console. First the parent component gets rendered, then the regular component, and then the pure component. After that, for every 3 seconds, only the parent component and the regular component is rendered. For the same state and prop, the pure component is not re-rendered. So in conclusion, pure components optimize React codes and also improves performance. So coming to the last topic, component lifecycle. So basically, component lifecycle explains the stages the component goes through. The entire lifecycle of a component can be divided into 3 parts. We have mounting, updation, and unmounting. So the first thing that gets invoked in the lifecycle is component will mount. It is invoked right before the initial rendering occurs. Then we have the rendering method. Now once a component is inserted into the DOM, component did mount gets invoked. Coming to the next phase, we have updation. When a component receives props, component will receive props gets invoked. Set state is called when the state of the property changes. So every time there is a change, React decides whether the next component's state should trigger a re-render or not. To do that, should component update method is called. Component will update is invoked right before re-rendering. After re-rendering, component did update is called that makes updates to the DOM. And the last phase is unmounting. Component will unmount method does all the necessary cleanup and erases all the allocated memory and cycles. Moving ahead, let's learn about another striking feature of React.js called props. Props, short for properties, allow the user to pass arguments or data to components. A parent component can pass additional information to its children using props. Properties help make components more dynamic. Props are passed to components in the way similar to that of HTML tag attributes. Now we'll look at this a little later in the video. Props in a component are read-only and cannot be changed. One thing to remember is that props are sent by the parent to the children components. Hence, the children components cannot make any changes to these props. Now that we've learned about props in brief, let's go ahead and create our application using props. If you're new to this tutorial, I suggest you go to the React installation and React components video on our channel. So back in my code editor, that is VS Code, I've opened a folder called React Props. And now I'm going to create a component, a class component, and I'll call it class props.js. So let's create the class component. I give RCE, the snippet. And here I display a message saying an h1 tag basically. Alright. Now let me get rid of export here and import it in my app.js main component. Here I say import class props. Alright. Now we define the class component in our render method. Let's say. Alright. Now if we go back to the browser, you see hello learners, welcome to Simplilearn. Now let's say we want to individually welcome every student. Instead of retyping the message for everybody, we can pass their names as props. Now let's see how to do that. Now we pass the name as a property from the main component, that is app.js, to the child component and render this onto the browser. So let's do that. So here, while I'm defining my child component, I say name. I save it, and here in my child component, instead of learners, I use the keyword this dot props dot name. Let me save it, and if you look at the browser, we'll have hello learner 1, welcome to Simplilearn. Now let's go ahead and welcome learner 2 and learner 3. So I again say class props name equals learner 2. Alright, so if we save and look at the browser, we'll have all the 3 learners displayed on the browser. We can also pass multiple props to the child component. Now say for example, we want to welcome the student from a particular place. So we say welcome learner 1 from place X. So I can here define another property, say place, and say place. Similarly, I can do it for the rest too. Say place Y. Now let's go back to our class props.js component and here say hello learner 1 from this dot props dot place. Let me save it. And if you look at the browser now, we have hello learner 1 from place X, place Y and place Z. We can also display whatever we want between the opening and closing tags when invoking a component. Now this is facilitated using props.children reserved keyword. Now let me explain to you how it's done with an example. Here, let's split the self and closing tag into an opening and a closing tag. And in between them, let me display a message within the paragraph tag. Let me say, and in my child component, after my h1 tag, let me use a paragraph tag, and here let's use the reserved keyword this dot props dot children. So let's save it. And now if you look at the browser, you can here see the message displayed child component. So props.children can be used when components do not know about their children ahead of time. This is commonly seen in components like sidebar and dialog that represent generic boxes. So let's go ahead and create a button tag and check again. So here I'll split it and add a button tag and say click. And let's check our browser. Here we go. We get the output as expected. Alright, we saw the usage of props for class components. Similarly, we can use it for functional components. So let's go ahead and create a functional component. Let me call it, I say import React from React. And then I say function props. And here I return an h3 tag. I'll say this is functional component, and I'll return another h3 tag saying hello learner. So let me save this and let's export it. Export default function props and import it in our app.js again. Import function prop from function prop. And here in our render method, let's define it. Let me call function prop name. Let me give learner 4 and place say A. Let me close it. And back in our functional component, instead of learner, I say props.name. Let me save it. Now, if you look at our browser, it gives us an error. It says props is not defined. So let's go back to our code editor and pass props here to our functional component. Also, let me define hello props.name from props.place. Let me enclose it within the div tag here. Let me save it. And now if you look at our browser, here we go. We get the output as expected. Let's begin and learn what exactly is a state in React. Typically, a state is an object that stores the values of properties belonging to a component. Now, these values can change over a period of time either via user interactions or network changes. And the state helps facilitate this functionality. Every time the state changes, React re-renders the component to the browser. The state is initialized in the constructor. A state can also store multiple properties. A method called setState is used to update the value of the state object. Now this function performs a shallow merge on the new and the previous state. Conventionally, a shallow merge ensures that the previous state values are overwritten by the new state values. Moving on, in our previous video, we learnt about props. And although props and state dictate and control the behavior of a component, they have significant differences. So let's go ahead and draw a comparison between the two. Firstly, props in a component are used to pass data and event handlers to its children, while state on the other hand is used to store the data that has to be rendered on the web page. Props are immutable. Once set by the parent, they cannot be changed. State holds volatile data and can be changed over time. Props can be used in functional and class components, while state is restricted to class components. Props are set by the parent component, while a state is generally updated by event handlers. Now that we've learned all about state, let's go ahead and build an application to see the working of state. Alright, so in my code editor, that is VS Code, I've created my application, say state, and here in my source folder, I have my app.js file. Now here, I'm going to get rid of all the unnecessary code that I'm not going to be using. Also, I suggest you go through the React installation on Windows video to help you get started with creating your first application. So let's create our class component, say class app extends react.component. And inside, I have a render method that returns an HTML tag. Let's display a message, welcome. Let's follow the JSX conventions and enclose all the HTML tags within the div tag. So I say div class name equals app. We also have to import the app.css file, import app.css. And so we save it, and if you look at the browser, we have welcome. Now let's beautify our code. To do that, let's add some styling. So here in my app.js class component, I say styles equals, and I say font style, and I set it to say bold, and I say color, say teal. And here in my h1 tag, I say style equals this dot styles. So let me save it, and if we look at the browser now, we have welcome in teal and it's bold. Now let's go ahead and create a class component to understand state. So first I create a folder and I call it components, and inside this folder I create a class component and I call it new comp.js, and I use the snippet RCE to create the class component. To give you an insight into what we're doing today, we'll display a message asking the user to subscribe to Simplilearn. Once the user clicks on the subscribe button, we instruct them to click on the bell icon. And finally, we display a thank you message. Now to do all of this, we're going to make use of state. And as mentioned earlier, we initialize the state object in a constructor. So let's use the snippet rconst to create our constructor. Now in the state object, we initialize a property, let's call it message, and we display a message saying subscribe to Simplilearn. Let's save it. And here in our render method, let's say class name equals app, and let's create an h3 tag, and within the tag I display the message. So I say this dot state dot message. Let's save it, and now let's import it in our app.js component. So I get rid of export here, and here I say import new comp from components and new comp, and let's define it here and say new. So we save it and look at the browser, it says subscribe to Simplilearn. Alright, again to make our code look more presentable, let's add in styles. So I'll just copy the same styles that I've added here and I paste them here, and instead of bold I make it italic, and I change the color to say purple. And again in my h3 tag I define style and initialize it to this dot styles. So let me save it, and now if you look at the browser, it's in italic and it's in purple. Okay, so moving ahead, let's create a button that reads subscribe, and once the user clicks on it, the button should read subscribed, and the message displayed above should instruct the user to click on the bell icon. To do that, let's first create a button. The message that I want the button to read is subscribe. However, this message gets changed once the user clicks on the button. So instead of explicitly mentioning subscribe here, I create a prop. I say sub and I say subscribe here. And back in my render method, I say this dot state dot sub. So let's save it. And if you look at the browser now, you have a button which displays a message subscribe. Now once the user clicks on the button, the message displayed should change to click on the bell icon to never miss an update. So let's create an event handler for that. So here, button on click, I call another method and let's call the method button change. Okay, so this method should update the state and change the message and sub values. To do that, we make use of a setState method. Now a state can be updated in response to event handlers, server responses or prop changes. Now all the updation can be done using the setState method. Now this is the general syntax used by the method. We'll however look at this further in the demo. Now the setState method conventionally enqueues all the updates made to the component state and instructs React to re-render the component and its children with the updated state. Now let's go back to our code editor and look at the working of this method. Now here I define the arrow function button change. If you are not familiar with arrow functions, I suggest you read up on them. And this is the general syntax. And here I say this dot set state. And inside I change my message to hit the bell icon to never miss an update. And my sub value changes to subscribed. Let's save this. And now if you look at the browser, when we click on the subscribe button, the message changes to hit the bell icon to never miss an update. So moving ahead, let's use a bell icon so that the user can click on it. Once he clicks on the image changes and a thank you message appears on the screen. So for that, I have two images. I have bell A and bell B. So I drag and drop both the images in my components folder. Alright. Now let's import these images into our new comp.js file. Here I say import bell A from bell A.png and again I say import bell B from bell B.png. Alright, let me save it. To display the image on the screen, we make use of the image tag. Now this tag has two attributes. One is the source attribute that specifies the URL and the other is the alt attribute that specifies an alternate text for the image. So here in my component, I make use of a paragraph tag that will help display the image in the next line, and then I use the image tag. Now since my image changes once it's clicked, I have to define a property and pass the event handler click that will update the image. So here, before specifying the source, let's go back to our state and define another property that is image URL and let's set it to bell A, since that is the image that I want to display first. Let me save it, and here in my image tag I say source equals this dot state dot image URL, and then we have the alt tag, and I do not want to display any message, so I leave it as it is. Now let's save it, and if you look at the browser, we have a bell displayed. However, now let's change the dimensions of the bell. I do not want such a huge bell. So back in my VS Code, I define style with width, say 30 pixels and a height with again 30 pixels. Let me save this. And now if you look at the browser, we have a smaller icon. So once the user clicks on this image, the image changes and the message displayed here gets updated. To do that, we'll have to define an event. So let's go back to our VS Code, and here in my image tag, let's say on click, I define a method, say this dot image change. And now we define this method here. I say image change. I make use of an arrow function again. And again, I use the setState method. I update the image. So I say image URL is now set to bell B. And the message is updated to thank you, happy learning. So let's save this now. And if we look at the browser, we see the image, and once clicked on it, the image gets updated and the message changes. So finally, let me refresh the browser once and show the full execution. Let me refresh. Following the instructions, let's click on the subscribe button. And now it says hit the bell icon, and once I do that, the image updates and the message changes. Now that you know the basics of React, let's look at a simple tutorial to build a calculator app.
So our demo is going to be about creating a calculator using React and Node.js. And so we have here just a basic calculator, nothing crazy, but the whole thing is going to be created with React. And so we'll be using JavaScript, we'll be installing React and installing the various components such as Node.js and the different NPM solutions that we need. So as you can see, the calculator works just fine. And now let's go ahead and let's go and install the different tools that we need. So the first one is going to be Node.js, and we do a Google search on Node.js. We always start with Google searches because it's the easiest way to find things. And so we go to the default Node.js site, and you can go to downloads. And there are Windows, Mac OS, and also Linux installers. You can also download the original source code and compile it yourself if you want. You'll also need a text editor. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. It's just my favorite text editor. It's free, works across all platforms. It comes with a ton of extensions, so you can get up and running really quickly with it. So we're just going to go ahead and install the Windows version. I already have it installed, so I don't have to download it again. You also want to make sure that you have the latest version of Node.js installed with the Node Package Manager. So we're just going to open up our terminal window and validate which version that we have running. And we can do that fairly easily. We can just put in node -- version, and it'll tell us which version, which means that's installed. And the same thing with npm Node Package Manager. We'll do npm -- version, and that will give us back the version number. Again, you have to have them installed for them to be able to do that. And we're going to also now create a React app. So we're going to do install, and then it's going to be create -react -app. That's the command to create a new React app. And we're going to install it right off our desktop. So let's go in and we'll put npx create -react -app. And then the app is going to be called Calculator, which will install a folder on our desktop with all the appropriate React code. And this will be just a template application, but it'll have everything there that we need to get started with. Hit return, and that'll take a few minutes just to install everything. And here we go. And so as we go through some of the components that we're going to be creating today, we're going to be creating an app component, and there'll be the main component that has all the information that will then be displayed on the screen. Then we have a layout component, and there will be the actual look and feel of the calculator, and the output component, which will be the results from the calculator, and then the output row. And this will be all the different tools that we will need. And here we have our new folder right there on our desktop. But we're actually going to go now into Visual Studio. And if you've seen any of the other Node.js videos that we've created, you know that I like to work with Node.js in Visual Studio Code because I can run terminal window right there. So I'm going to open up the folder that we just created. That's called Calculator. And we open up the whole folder, not a file, but the whole folder. And here's our folder on the left-hand side. We have all the different files. Here's our JSON package that has the instructions for what the calculator looks like, including which version of React and the DOM. And here's our default elements. And as you can see, because we're using React, it's going to embed the code into a HTML page. And so we have a div with the ID of root that's going to reference some class files that we create. And so the app.js file has the application code that we're going to be modifying in a little bit. And you'll see that it actually then references up to our index.js file. And if in index.js file, it has the ID element root, which ties back to the ID element of root in our HTML file. So we're constantly referencing and cross-referencing our application. And this is where we're going to be doing most of our work. All right, so we're going to go ahead and open up the terminal window. And the first thing we want to do is start npm, and it's now going to have everything running on, it's going to have localhost and everything running on port 3001. We'll give that a moment, and this will actually then bring up just the standard default React boilerplate app. It's just taking a moment to load. I should probably get a faster computer. Oh, hey, there we are. Just not patient. So here we have our basic boilerplate React.js application. Nothing too crazy here. So let's actually go in and start working in some of our code. So let's see now. Yep, everything's running where we expect it to run. All right, so let's go into app.js. And we can actually go ahead, and if you want to type Control+C and actually stop the app, or you can, in the terminal window, you can actually stop it. You can also go up into the terminal command to stop it as well. And if we do stop the app, then we'll get an error message. There we go. The site can't be reached. And you'd expect this. We're going to go back in, and we're going to just restart our application. Everything should now be working just fine. We're going to refresh the page, and we'll see our default React app. Coming up on port 3001. And there we are. Looking good, looking good. Okay. So we're going to delete out what we have there because we want to put in our own content. And we're going to call this one class app, and we're going to go in and we're going to be modifying that class here in just a moment. We'll put in default layout. I'm going to create a new folder. This folder is going to be called components. This is going to be for our calculator. And put a new file in there. I'm going to call this one layout.js. And this is where we're going to start breaking down the structure of our layout. And we're going to select import layout. And then we want to do the path to our layout. Components, layout. And you notice that we have the dot because we have to go up one folder. That's the command for that. So dot up one folder, components folder, layout. Notice we don't have to type layout.js. It automatically knows to add the .js extension. Constantly making sure that we're saving. Let's go over to layout.js, and this is our layout. And we do this using CSS. Then we're going to import React from React, and then select import. And then we're going to link to layout CSS. This is going to be a CSS file that we're going to create. So we're going to have to type that in, layout.css. And notice we had to write out explicitly that it's a CSS file. And so here we have, and then we're going to put in the constructions for the layout. what our props look like. And then we'll export default layout so it can show up correctly. Okay, so we go to our web page now. Yep, that's good. We were expecting to see that. So we need to change some of our pathing here just quickly. So let's see now. We're going to move a file so that it can be accessed appropriately. Rerun this. You know what? I think we didn't. We have to update. Yep, I know. We have to go back to layout and we have to start adding in some values here so that the application knows to lay content out. So we can just put in a hello world. There we are. Okay, so that shows us that everything is pulling through correctly. So we want to get rid of hello because we're going to replace that with our own application. I'm going to change this div so that it actually starts pulling in the application. And we're going to put in the class name for calculator, and this will be a CSS reference. Okay, so we need to have some image files. And what we're doing here is we're essentially building up the different elements that will need to be presented on the screen. And then we'll have a CSS file that we'll use to create these elements. And as you can imagine, I've already got this written, so I'm cheating a little bit because I know what I'm putting here. But bottom line is that the calculator really is a bunch of form elements, such as buttons on the screen, but we're going to use CSS to reformat them so that it looks more like a traditional calculator. That's one of the things that you get comfortable working with when you're doing web applications, is how to take technologies that you're used to using and then modifying them so that they look different. And so in this instance, we're used to using button elements within an application. So why not use the same button elements, which consistently work from browser to browser, and then just simply update the look and feel of them with some CSS so that they look good. And here we are just doing a very simple on-click command. This is some basic JavaScript that will render inside of the browser itself. Okay, so now we see, boom, there's a button. All right, so, and again, you want to be constantly testing and verifying that the code you're writing is working correctly. And we're going to do another button, and this is going to be the delete button. So we're going to start building out our different buttons here. Alright, so that's our delete. Now we have an on-click event for that. Okay, we're just doing some formatting here. Okay, so we just used going through our code here, make sure everything looks good. And one of the things we can now do, because we've got a baseline that looks correct, we can just copy that, and then we want the percentage sign and then the forward bracket. So this. So it gives us 2 buttons. So we have start a new row here. And I'm just going to copy everything over, just to make it a little bit easier on ourselves. And then we're just going to pipe in the numbers 7, 8, 9, and then plus symbol. Sorry, the multiply symbol. And we'll be able to move these into multiple rows here in just a moment. And we just want to keep going through, making all the changes here so we actually fill out all the different elements. So as you can see, most of this isn't really complex. It's just the, we use the word fiddly. Yeah, I guess I can. The fiddly parts of putting this content together. So we refresh our screen, start seeing all the different elements. Okay, looking good. We'll have to come back and make some updates to our CSS class names. And then we do our final 3 buttons across the bottom. Okay, so let's now add some styles to the content that we've created. We do that in our layout.css file. And so we already have some styles that we created. So we're just going to go ahead and for the sake of brevity, we're just going to pull those over. We can, if you want to, and have us do a more detailed video on how to create the CSS files, and we'll certainly do that. But I think most of you probably know how to do this already. All right, so here's our CSS file. And so we have our calculator, our keys, our buttons, and the different types of button here. So we can just copy these all over. And so these all have the background color, the border color, etc., etc. And so when we do that, ta-da, here we have our buttons for our app. Easy way you know how. Okay, so we take out the CSS, and then we just have basic buttons. We add the CSS link back in. We have a nice laid out application. So we've got a couple of areas that are still missing. We've got the results screen and the default logo. So go ahead and add that information in. And we'll create a new folder called assets. Underneath assets, we'll put another folder called font. And that'll be where our fonts will be. Then we'll create another folder and we'll call this one images. And we'll put our images in there. So we'll have our logo image, just Simplilearn logo. And then for layout, we can then just reference that in our image reference. So I'm going to import the logo. I'm going to import that from our assets folder. And under assets, we'll go to img, which is where we have our image. And then we'll do the path for the logo.png. So we'll move this. And then we'll do source. And we'll do the source is from our logo variable, which is has the import of the image. So we'll put the width. And we happen to know it's 150 pixels, and there we go, it's 150 pixels wide. And the style that we'll reference from CSS will be block. So just some inline styling here. Generally, normally do this. I normally have all my styling in my CSS folder, but in this instance, because we're just putting up a solution, I want you to be able to see that you can actually do this inline. So there we are, have our Simplilearn logo. Okay, so now we need to have the results screen. Make sure that looks correct. Okay. And so we're going to create a new folder, and this is going to be called our output.js file. And this is going to control the output in that blue screen. We're going to import our React objects. And we'll export that. And we'll put a new file called output.row.js. So we'll put our instructions. This is going to be our component the users will put their results into. And output row. And we're going to put our instructions here. So we're going to export default output row. All right, so we're going to start putting together the code that allows us to construct our solution. We're going to update the output row.js file, and we're going to add in our return value. So we'll put a div, and this will be an input type. So essentially we have a text field that will be read-only at the top of our calculator. And here we see our text field here. And that will allow us to be able to put in our values. And we use the class screen that allows us to give our formatting. And we're going to put a file. It's going to be output row.css. We're going to add in our specific CSS for this output row. And as you can see, we're just using all of our standard HTML5 skill sets here. And let's go over to our style. We'll pull in our props.text size. And then the default value. And so this is going to align with our, go over to our CSS file and we'll update that. And output.js. We'll make sure the results get returned correctly as we're tapping on the buttons. And so this will pull in our output row. And the value will be, we'll put in our text size for output flow here. And we're just going to put some sample CSS styling here. Nothing too crazy. And we're going to have 2 rows. Save that. And our 2 rows will appear in a moment. Let's go into our layout. Let's add in our rows. So this is our output. I'm going to pull in those values. And there we have our 2 values. And so we can apply some CSS styling to this. So the top row will be the calculation broken out as we've written it, and the bottom row will be the results. And let's go into our CSS file here. We're going to copy over some CSS, and you have some font styling. We have our screen class name. That's our screen here. Again, this is nothing, no rocket science here. If you've done any CSS editing, you'll be familiar with what we've done here. And you see that we're referring to a font asset. We don't actually have the font in there. We'll have to pull that font over. And it's just a TTF font, TrueType font. You can use any of the internet fonts as well. Google has a massive library of fonts. And there we are. We're going to change the size of our font so that the second row, the text is a little bit bigger. A little bit small. And we don't have anything wired up yet. We'll do that in a moment. That'll be the easy part of this assignment. All right, so let's go over and now layout. Okay, so let input, set input, and use state. That way we can default the initial state. And for the result, the use state, the initial use state will be just blank. There we go. Just what you'd expect to see. So the results are blank, and this is just when you run the app for the very first time. Okay, so we're going through, and now we want to put in our actions. So we're going to have an event when we click on any of the buttons. We want to take the value of the button, and so it's going to be any of these actions here. And we're just going to put together our script to do the calculations. So as you can see so far, we've put most of this application, most of the hard work has been setting up the base React application, putting together the different files and folder structure, making sure we have the correct assets such as images, fonts, CSS files, laying out our core structure in HTML, form elements, and now the part that we're doing at the end here is putting together the script that will actually do our calculator events. And honestly, this is going to be we've got this running here. It's just JavaScript. So there are lots of JavaScript calculators on the internet. So you can actually take any of those and use those as a base for what we're doing here. And there we have if there's an error, we'll do a math error result. We don't expect to see that. And we'll just keep putting together our code here. So our different results. So depending on which command you use, so for instance, if it's the equal sign, and you have the results. So we're using the value to actually then trigger what we would actually be seeing in which screen. Okay, that's looking good. So we'll capture our value, and this is all concatenated together. And if there are any error messages, so if the value is C from the button, so if we select C, so we want to set the input to 0, which is to reset the screen. And if the value equals, and this will be delete, what we want to do is we want to manipulate the string on the screen, which means we're going to eliminate the last character entered. And this is manipulation here. And this is all reducing the length of the string by 1 character at a time. Again, this is your standard JavaScript control. So we hit delete, and that gets rid of a character, another character. Hit it again, I'll get rid of a third character. And we'll put, if the string is 0, then we'll put that as the value. All right. This allows us to test out our application. All looking good so far. Okay. I want to make sure that we're then calculating our values correctly. And here we have the display and the input. It's all coming from here, our output class. And then we'll put in our results. Okay, it looks like we're lining everything up. Just always want to go back and double check that you have all your commands, all your variables lining up correctly. Eliminate those. And we'll make sure we have the answer and the user entered there. There we have the answer and the user, and we'll change the font size. We save that. We'll go over, and this is our local application. And we test it, we can start putting together our construct, and we'll see that our calculator is working. So clear gets rid of both values. Everything's looking pretty good. And here we have our first application, and this is the sample application. This is the application we just wrote. Here is the original application that we were testing against. And as you can see, everything lines up correctly. And so you've seen how in just 45 minutes, you can actually write out your own React.js application with Node.js. And so if we terminate the application, so this is the one we just built. It's going to fail, so it allows us to validate that we had actually created. We'll restart the services. Say yes. We'll run it on another port because we already have an app running on another port. So it's going to run on 3001, refreshing the web page. And voila, there we are. There's our application up and running. Everything looks really good, working fine. It works absolutely identically. Now, if you want to, you could actually then take this application and make it a native application as well. Right now, we're just using it as a web application. And we're just updating some of the CSS, making it a little bit tighter. Everything looking exactly the same. There we go. That's your app, all up and running.
And so with that, we come to the end of this session. I hope you have a good understanding of React now. Thank you so much for being here. Keep learning and stay tuned to Simplilearn.